So we'll go ahead and thank you guys for everybody being here. I'm honored to be back. I was with ARC up until about 6 months ago, based in India. I moved back to New York and sort of now on the other end of the solar universe, working on projects here in New York City. So I always joke that my last mile now is Staten Island, and I don't really go any further beyond that, which is quite nice. So I'm excited to be moderating this particular discussion because when I was at ARC, I actually worked very closely on a few different microgrid projects, actually, with most of the folks that are here on the panel. So for me, it's great because it's also sort of a reunion to have us all here in New York. What we want to talk about, as the name suggests, is everybody who's in the room here, obviously who's been working in the energy space for the last few years, knows that there's been sort of a momentum sort of building behind the idea and increasingly the deployment of microgrids as a really viable, cost-effective mode of delivering electricity to the underserved. So we also know, though, that there's a number of barriers and problems and challenges that actually still face microgrid development and developers. So what we really want to capture in this, we're lucky to have a great panel here of folks that are really developing microgrids or involved in different aspects of microgrid development and management in different parts of the world. So we want to kind of talk about how some of those challenges are really being removed through innovative technology and particularly through innovative partnerships. Who are the different types of actors that have to be brought together to really overcome some of those challenges? What I'm going to do, I'll introduce the panel briefly, as with the panel this morning. The full bios are in the program, so you can see that. But I'll introduce them quickly. What I'll also do is I'd like to be able to, I'll ask questions to a specific panel member, but anybody can chime in if you have thoughts. We'll have a bit of a conversation. And I want to involve you all actually a little bit earlier. So actually, after maybe 15, 20 minutes of a conversation, I'll start taking some questions from the audience as we go to. I think we'll be stimulating enough up here, but hopefully that will keep you awake after the delicious lunch. So let me go ahead and introduce from my far end down. We've got Amit Mehta, who's the Managing Director of Vayam Renewables. We've got Mitra Ardron, who's the founder and president of Lumeter Technologies. They'll all be explaining what these are in just a moment. Alakesh Chetia is the global director of the Eradicate Darkness campaign for SunEdison. And Mang is the founder and CEO of the Weaker Section Development Society, or WSDS. So why don't we start off real quickly, if we can actually really adhere to this. If everyone can give us just a sort of a minute-long synopsis of what you're working on right now as it relates to microgrids, just to give people a sense of who's in the conversation. So we'll start with you, Amit.
So let me start by saying that we have been looking at microgrids for the past 2 years. We also have set up one of the largest microgrids in India, which is about an 80 kilowatt microgrid in a village which is about 150 kilometers from Patna, in a place called Dharnai. And it's an AC grid, and there have been multiple learnings for us, especially in terms of, this was done in partnership with Greenpeace and ARC Finance. The learnings here have been tremendous, some good, some interesting, and some, let's say, we are still trying to digest. So keeping that in mind, all I would say is that a microgrid is, the technology may be relevant. Its social context and its commercial context today are still to be understood, defined, and properly structured.
Great. Mitra?
Yeah, so Lumeter develops and sells pay-as-you-go and rent-to-own technology. We cover microgrids, solar home systems of both the component and the boxed kind, and stuff like pumping and other things which can be sold on a pay-as-you-go or rent-to-own basis. In the microgrid space, we're both AC and DC. We're agnostic about the two. And we're not dependent on mobiles for the pay-as-you-go technology, which I think is a crucial difference. We're also working with our investors on a fund called SEAL, which stands for Scalable Energy Access Loans, which is intended to bring replicable finance to pay-as-you-go and rent-to-own companies in the field, focusing on the 5,000 to 500,000 space, which is where we think most of the interesting work in mini-grids is happening. $500,000, not 500,000 watts. So that's us in a nutshell.
All right. SunEdison is one of the largest IPPs in the world, and its claim to fame it's the company that invented the power purchase agreement that changed the solar industry. Of course, that's what we have used for the 2,000 megawatt of solar power plants that we have worldwide in about 40 countries. But these are in developed countries where these are large projects that are connected to the grid. The challenge that I have taken on and what I'm trying to look into is how do we bring a similar model to the developing countries vis-a-vis microgrids. We have been operating our first microgrid that we installed was in India in 2011. So for the last 3 years, we have been operating that and others that we have brought online since then. And of course, we'll talk about the learnings, the hurdles, and the issues as we go through this panel.
Yeah, I'm Mang. I'm coming from a place which is nearing Myanmar border. And even in India also, we are on the corner part of India where traditional village institutions are still existing. And we have ventured into this solar sphere in 2010 with lanterns. And then we graduated to home lighting system. And now we are in the stage of implementing and starting a pilot on microgrid with the support of ARG and SunEdison, who is Alakesh, who is sitting next to me.
Great, thanks. So I think we'll do, I know that there's a high level of general knowledge about, obviously, energy access in this room, but I think it's worth starting with defining some of the terminology, actually, because anybody who's been looking at microgrids realize that there's a lot of actual change about that term. You hear of microgrids and mini-grids and nanogrids and now paragrids, and sometimes these things are used interchangeably and synonymously, but sometimes people are actually making really hard distinctions between them. So I thought it would be a good place to start at a very high level. If we could just sort of define what are the common elements really that make up microgrid, and what are some of the important distinctions that we're actually seeing in very different types of models that are really coming online that are still fall under the microgrid rubric. So I was going to start with you, Alakesh, but again, we can take it from there.
The way we view microgrid is it's just a smaller version of the grid that we are all familiar with. As far as the consumer is concerned, you flip on a switch and the light comes on, and you don't have to worry about anything else. And you pay for electricity that you use. Now, in terms of mini-grid, microgrid, I see different applications in terms of the definition. There are DC mini-grids. Some of them are called mini-grids when it's AC, and if it is DC, it's microgrid. And some say that it's by size. Again, all the nanogrid and picogrid right now.
Picogrid.
So the definition that I have come across is if it is 1 kilowatt and bigger, it can be a microgrid. If it is 10 kilowatt or something, can be a mini grid. And this picogrid is, I have seen 250 watt systems that are serving 3-4 households nearby. That's a picogrid or a nanogrid. And then the paragrid, which is an interesting term. We often think about energy access for people that have no access whatsoever. And that term, or the number as we know, is about 1.3 billion people worldwide. But there is another billion people in the developing countries that are connected to the grid, but they don't get electricity. And so if you set up another mini grid in parallel to that grid that exists, that apparently becomes a paragrid. So anyway, so much for nomenclature, I guess. Anybody else would like to add?
Add to it. It was interesting because I reacted halfway through your talk without hearing the rest of it, right? The terminology is less important than what we define in or out. And we see in a lot of reports that the definition of microgrid is written from the perspective of what the report writer wants to see classified as a grid, as a microgrid, or as whatever they're calling it. And it's really important that there are viable solutions as low as a couple of hundred watts. Really, a microgrid you can think of as anything where you have one generator that's supplying multiple separate customers. And that's really the definition of whatever you call it, grid.
So I'll try to answer it differently, because one of the things that we have been noticing is that there are multiple solutions, nanogrid and microgrid, where entrepreneurs do the charging and deliver products. Now, is that a mini grid? Is that a microgrid? What kind of grid is that? But these are the definitions that all of us are now trying to fathom with and try to figure out what is it that a microgrid should consist of. For me, a microgrid consists of connecting multiple houses to do multiple purposes and not only lighting.
Again, that's not a universally held definition either. One of the key things about microgrids that I find is less the grid part of it. Certainly there's as part of the core definition is, as you said, it's some generating unit, multiple customers. But it's the service arrangement versus the ownership of a product, where the beneficiary of it is paying for a service as we do as utility ratepayers. And that has all kinds of implications for sustainability and for affordability for low-income people. So just as sort of following up on that initial question around definitions, what are really the core unique advantages that we see microgrids, any way that you want to define it, if you define it as minimally as I just did, versus other types of energy solutions that are more product-based, that require ownership, that are more distributed? And again, from the point of view of the beneficiary and also from a company, what are the clear advantages, I guess, of microgrids as a energy access technology? Anyone who wants to take that, I think everybody would be.
Okay. I would say the key advantages are you get to share a common resource, which is both its advantage and its disadvantage, in that if you've got a solar home system and you're out for the day, the power it generated doesn't get used. Whereas in a mini grid, you can share that across multiple people and you can balance off load stuff, depending on how you set it up. I think the other key advantage is, and in many ways the decision as to when to use one and when to use solar home systems, is the costs may be lower if you're dealing at high enough density. And what that density is, at which a microgrid is better than a solar home system, in part depends on the technology you're using, but I think is really the key definition. There's places I would never build a microgrid because the houses are too far apart. And it's going to cost you more to lay the copper between the houses than it would do to put a smaller solar panel on each house.
I think to Amit and Mang, to answer that question from the direct experience of your organization. So we'll start with Mang and then to Amit, but I know WSDS has made this progression from lanterns and has a solar home system business as well, and now is embracing microgrids. So where does microgrids for you fit into the overall energy service that you're providing? Why microgrids for WSDS?
Yeah, this microgrid I can explain in two angles. One will be from the community perspective, and one I can say from the organization perspective. Community as a whole, we have started with a lantern. So in one way, we have been exposing them to more lights. We have given them some sort of a bait, and then they have started having the habit of having the small light. And then since we are working closely with these communities, they were demanding for more lights. So we have come up with this home lighting system of two products of 45 watt and 75 watt. And then as we go and journey along, we came to realize and understand that, since we are also running our microfinance operation together parallelly with running with this solar program also, a stage has come that why not explore microgrid? Exploring microgrid can support our microfinance activities in terms of building more different livelihood opportunities. with lights, it's not about just providing lights, but it's about giving them different alternative source of livelihood activities. So that is from the community perspective. And from microfinance, as a microfinance organization, our perspective and vision is that even when we entered a village, when we form a groups, it is hardly that all the villages comes together and form a group. There are always few household or a mother or a family being left out from the microfinance program. So from the organization perspective, we said if we can start this microgrid, all the villages can avail this light, and this can also act as one of the medium where we can also, spread out our goals and vision and mission of what we are trying to achieve for overall livelihood promotion and development. That's why we are into microgrids. And hopefully by 24 December, we'll have the first microgrid, and that will be a good
project very dear to my heart as well.
yeah.
I spent a lot of time out there. I'd like to Amit's sort of response to the same, and maybe you can give a little bit of background on Basics, the parent company. Yeah.
So basically, we are part of the Basics group, and the Basics group has been in the key mode of livelihood management and livelihood enhancement to the underserved for the past 20 years. So what we have within the group is an excellent learning of customer behavior, what the underserved actually want, why do they want a particular service, and what is the advantage of increasing revenue versus consumption loans. So those were the 4 key learnings that we had, and we understood that the underserved is not a single paradigm. Within the underserved, there are multiple layers of different expectations. And if we went in with products for each of them, the cost of ownership for the customers would be very high. So we realized that let's go into a village or let's go into an urban slum. The expectations of every customer for their own energy needs was very different. The ability to pay was very different. And the products they wanted to run were very different. So what we keeping this whole track in mind, what we realized was that if we can generate power centrally and become a utility provider, does it meet the aspirational needs of most of our customers? The answer was yes and no. Because the aspirational needs of customers and the need for power or energy is significant. But the ability to pay and ability to cross differential between a grid, power grid versus a microgrid in terms of cost per unit was significantly different. The case of point being that for a microgrid to be reasonably successful commercially, it needed an X amount of money per unit. But the grid was able to supply the same power at X minus 60%. How do I compete with that? So that was one of the questions that we kept looking at. And we started understanding that grids, microgrids not only need to be socially relevant, we followed what we follow now is the so-called STC model, which is it has to be socially relevant, socially adaptable. The technology has to be meeting a particular purpose at which it's been set out to do. The minute energy access comes into a house, the consumption patterns of energy change drastically. People say initially that I just want to use it for X, Y, Z. The minute they get access to it, the aspirational features start coming in, and the energy utilization context start going significantly different. Can we factor that into the initial design? We cannot, because nobody guarantees that. Then the technology side, there's been huge advancements happening in that, but storage and metering are still challenges that we have to still address.
Let me actually jump on that particular point there, because we'll get back to the social complexity issue, which requires a response from everybody on the grid. But I think that one of the reasons why we're seeing recently sort of the emergence of the microgrid as a more viable option isn't just because of the lowering cost of solar and changes to the fundamental storage and generation parts, but all the other gaps that exist that there could be potentially technological solutions for. And that's where Lumeter and several other companies have come. So you just mentioned a couple of them. The issue of how do you actually monitor a system's performance? How do you actually control how much one household can use versus another household? How do you do that remotely? And I would like Mitra to talk a little bit about what some of those developments have been in recent years that are now enabling microgrids to happen that formerly weren't possible because those types of products weren't available.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's two real areas that this comes into. The first one is if you're going to supply a common resource to a whole bunch of people, the tragedy of the commons automatically applies. As soon as the grid is there, everyone will turn all the lights on and leave them on until the battery goes flat. If they don't have to pay for it, and if they don't have any kind of control over it. So that's been one of the fundamental barriers to mini-grids over the last decade or so when they've been technically possible, but only turning up in single-payer systems like hospitals and big businesses and stuff like that. So that's one aspect. So one of the things we saw in the early mini-grids was they would typically run for 4 hours at night. So you'd have a fixed amount of time, and then you'd have a fixed consumption where someone can only have 2 lamps and a mobile phone charger. And I spoke to one mini-grid operator who ran the baseball light patrol. They walked around the village at night looking for incandescent bulbs with a baseball bat because then they could reach up and break them. That limitation has been a real limitation on use, and that's one of the things that certainly our meters were designed to deal with, and I'm assuming other people's. The ability to be able to set consumption limits both on a per day and a peak basis. And the second aspect, which is equally important, is the collection of payments. We don't, these mini-grids are not living in a world where you can send out a paper bill and expect someone to go online and pay it with their credit card, right? How do you build in a payment mechanism where the customer both is easy for them to pay and is incentivized to pay, because if they don't pay, the system will turn off automatically without requiring someone to come around and knock on the door and tell them they're turning off their power and be given the sob story of, how could you turn off the power for your uncle's cousin's first arm removed. You've got to have both of those sides automatic for it to work. We've designed stuff for that. I mean, we're not the only people. So I think those are the things that have twigged mini-grids that have always been financially viable from being financially viable to actually being socially viable and
yeah, so particularly and this is something that the Darnay project had to look at really closely, is how is it that you are limiting the amount of power that someone can use, because it's not even the assumption that everybody is going to try to take extra. It's the idea that one person might be doing that. So if they're doing it, it's true tragedy of the commons. But I want to go back in a second to the social complexity issue in a second, because it's a really important dynamic that we saw very closely in Amit's project. But before we do that, a few minutes ago, Mr. Mang was explaining why they, as an MFI, was getting interested in microgrids in terms of how it's valuable to them and valuable to their customers. But I think it works both ways. What is it about microfinance institutions and similar community-based organizations? Why are they essential for what a company like SunEdison wants to do? Why are they key partners in making sure that microgrids are sustainably managed?
From our learning, if I put them into buckets of learning, technology is one bucket. We were actually the first customers for Simpa in India for our first microgrid. And of course, we were the guinea pigs. It didn't work for different reasons. Things they didn't know, we didn't know. So that's the nature of technology. You learn by doing it. So we have been learning about it. There are financial bucket where, again, how do you pay? What are the behaviors you inculcate? And I think Dipal mentioned in the morning session that it's very hard to introduce after the fact because behaviors get set in. So you have to do things from the beginning. So that's another bucket. But the third one, coming to your question, is the social bucket. I'll call that the social part of the solution is extremely important. And for a company like SunEdison, we can take care of the technology and the financing. But the social side needs local engagement. And I think there was a discussion in the morning as well, I think Willem mentioned as well, which is about trust. We go to places where they say solar doesn't work because their experience might have been with something like a solar home system, that worked for some time, then it stopped working. They don't understand that they drain the battery and it doesn't charge after some time when the depth of discharge went below the limits. But their perception is it doesn't work. So you need to work with partners that have the credibility, the engagement through other initiatives, other things that they have done, like WSDS that has provided microcredit for other things in those villages. And so when they come in with a partner like us, we get that trust, if you will, to set this up and say that this will work. So that's the most important thing we see in partnering with somebody, an NGO or organizations that are socially engaged through other initiatives over years, over the number of years.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to, on that, push it back to Amit, because that is, you're right, the essential function. And the experience, I think, between WSDS and Basics have been a bit different because the communities are so different. Absolutely. So the social complexity of Darnai, where it's not just what an individual, when you the game theory sort of aspect of this, where what would you do with this, but it's the fact that you have these complicated communities with multiple castes, different interest groups, all of that issue of who gets the fair share is amplified by these local types of issues, and that really has to be managed very carefully. So I don't know if you could give us the account of that, Amit.
So can you imagine a microgrid running 4 microgrids all in parallel? That's what we ended up doing. There were 4 communities who refused to let the cables go from one community to the other. They refused to let us even share any of the resources that were set up. That was the complexity we faced with. So we ended up setting up 4 microgrids, each running individually, each not interconnected because there was no cable. And just the overall complexity that got involved in that whole solution made the solution unviable. Imagine a situation where you have 4 offices within a village, each office serving 100 customers, 150 customers. When there's a load at one point and there's less consumption at one point, we cannot share it because there's no interconnectivity. If I do something here and if I don't do it some other part of the village, there is a fight. So all these complexities only lead to one point, is that everybody, and the best part is post the installation, the whole community has worked together to form a village committee. During the pilot phase, nobody was talking to each other. Now everybody is part of the community. So the learnings here have been 2 or 3, 4 magnified because of the complexity involved. Education to customers, critical. Expectation management, even more critical. Everybody says a microgrid will deliver power to you 24/7. We all know it's not going to happen. We all know there are going to be dark months. There are going to be months where power is going to be less. There's going to be months where power consumption is going to go up if it's a pay-by-meter solution. So, and the other thing we learned was we had to educate the customers that this grid is not a switch-on grid. You cannot come and put a TV tomorrow morning and think it will work because it has not been factored in. You cannot run a computer with the same solution. The customer expectation management to that point was so critical that the Darnai project has clearly shown that the effect of energy coming into a household can change both the productivity and the consumption pattern.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the key things that you see. As you go, you'll do a survey for a microgrid in a population that has no or very limited access to electricity. Their whole frame of reference for what is possible is based on that experience. Then once you start to have a little bit more reliable electricity from a grid, then everybody wants to plug in everything, and they start to imagine the possibilities of being electrified. So it's a big challenge about how you actually size these grids and control expectations. But Mitra, I mean, so we just talked about a specific project there. You're operating now in multiple countries on multiple continents with all kinds of different partners. Can you give us a bit of a report as well on some of the issues that you see and the challenges of actually trying to manage expectations?
Well, managing expectations would be more thing to ask our partners, but we see very different requirements in different countries. I mean, most of the stuff we see out of India in particular has been small DC grids of very low willingness to pay for electricity services. I mean, you mentioned 200 rupees per month, which I think is, we've heard that similar numbers from other people. So you've got to design grids for India on a very low willingness to pay, and potentially around what you were saying, Chris, is that once they get it and they're paying that much for it, they'll actually be willing to pay double for twice as much power. They just won't tell you that in the beginning, because when they want more services, they'll take them. In Africa, with much larger distances, we're seeing much more demand for AC, much more demand for higher current services. If it doesn't have TV, it's not worth having, is a common thing we hear back. And obviously, we hear people everywhere ask for refrigeration, but nobody actually wants refrigeration when they have to pay for it. A common thing. We see everyone playing around with the productive use issue. We see in many places this is now considered the productive use fallacy, which is that once you link productive use with residential, neither actually work very well, and that they almost need to be separately designed. Even if it's the same grid, the economics for both have to work independently.
So just go into that a little bit, because there is this sort of model or idea that's gained a lot of currency in support of the idea of the anchor,
right.
The anchor customer who's your main provider or customer, whether it's a telecom tower or a hotel, that's your predictable regular customer, and then around that you're able to build. So explain what some of your challenges are.
What we hear in DC, where the customer is USAID or philanthropic organizations or whatever, is dramatically different from what we hear from people in the field. Right? When we talk to people in the field, it's like everything has to pay for itself. If you've cross-subsidized the residential customer by the productive use, then when the residential customer wants this, which is exactly how the megagrid works, right? When the customer wants twice as much power, you don't want to sell it to them, because everything you sell to the customer, you're selling at a loss. So it's impossible to meet the expectations, which is why the grid's only on for 4 hours a day. If the utility company made money from selling rural customers power, the grid would be on 24 hours a day. But it's subsidized to the point where it's in every utility's interest to keep that grid off as much of the day as possible. Right? And that's the problem with cross-subsidy. The other problem we're seeing people concerned about is that if you've got a productive use, which is almost anything except for a telecom tower, then your biggest concern is load variability. Because if your productive use increases their power, either because their business grows or because of seasonal variability, or if they decrease it for similar reasons, then your economics don't work, because either the productive use is taking all the power and the village gets none, or the productive use is not using the power that you've allocated to them and you can't sell it on to the village. So I think unless you can make those economics work independently of each other, it's not going to work. Telecom towers are a different issue, but the biggest issue with telecom towers is they're a great anchor tenant, but telecom companies are impossible to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that as well, that the idea from a high level of, hey, you're putting this tower out here anyway, why don't you just slap a microgrid and then deal with collecting money from people as well? They're so different operationally that it's a bit naive, I think. But let me sure.
Finish on that. On the telecom towers, the other thing is we see a very different response from people in India, where the telecom towers are right next to the villages, from most of Africa, where the telecom tower is up on a hill. And if it's the same power system supplying both, you're going to be running a big fat cable between the two, and you might as well just put separate solar panels at both locations. So I think that's the other problem. A lot of these, one of the things we definitely see as a difference is people's perception of what will work depends a lot on what countries they've worked in. And people who've worked in Africa or people who've worked in Asia will have a different set of assumptions about what's viable and what isn't. And it's interesting how both of them see the other as just impossible.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I may jump in and add a few comments on the anchor load-based model, while I agree in terms of what Mitra said about cross-subsidizing may not work, but there are a few other issues that you need to tackle as well. Of course, with solar mini-grids, one of the big issues we all know is the upfront capital investment. So how do you build it out? And in the morning session, we discussed as well, you can't do it with equity. It has to be with debt. So how do you raise financing? So of course, as I mentioned, SunEdison has done PPAs with customers that are bankable, right? That's how we can raise debt. So how do we do rural electrification? So if we are providing to a telecom company or a bank for rural ATMs or such other productive use, those entities, those customers could be somewhat bankable. So that allows for capital to come in. That's one issue to think about. The second thing in terms of use point of view also to keep in mind is all the domestic use is typically in the night and it's mostly for lighting. And so the biggest cost also ends up being storage. But when you have commercial customers, especially if it is like a school or a college or university or such that have large daytime use, that's a nice use as well for solar systems. If you can use energy during the day, that energy is cheaper than the energy that you use at night. So the economics work better if you are able to mix it. So that's the counterpoint to that.
You can respond, and then I don't want to go back on my promise there. I'll take a question from the audience, but go ahead, Amit.
Okay. So the Dhanai experience taught us 2 or 3 things. One is that the telecom tower makes the project bankable, as you very clearly said. The bankability of a project for the long-term sustainability is extremely critical. Number 2 is the commercial load. We found that the bank and the wine store and some things around it, which needed a lot of power, during the day, we were able to service them better. And therefore, the chances of our increasing our value in terms of the investment that we had done also increased significantly. It brought a lot of commercial viability. The third element that came out very, very stark form was that the common elements like common lighting, etc., which were beneficial to the community, we were finding it very difficult for anybody to pay for it. So those started becoming the challenges that we had to address, and some of these challenges are still to be addressed by us.
Great. Let me take. Does anybody have any questions at all from the audience here? Pam. Oh, sorry.
So,
Is that on?
given the discussion just now about anchor tenants and households, what tariffs are you charging? How did you come up with them? And what is the expectations of what costs you're covering?
Should I answer that first or? Okay, so we realized very early on in our project that for us to recover what we have invested, or our partner invested, that's Greenpeace, because investment was done by Greenpeace and we were the community management and the kind of utility provider. We were just not able to even meet the cost of AMCs and the cost of running the grid or maintaining the grid through the kind of collections we were doing. So we started with a 2-light system for say 6 hours, 8 hours, which costs about 150 rupees. We faced a lot of resistance on that point. We had to increase it slightly more, but we now we've been left with the tsunami again. One day the power grid company comes in and puts a transformer there and says, now we're going to supply power to you from the grid at 1/4 the rate that we were supplying. So today we are in a dilemma of trying to understand how to service this customer. We know the grid is not going to give power for more than 2 hours. But the expectation of the customer has now changed, saying that the grid is giving me power at X divided by 4. Why are you charging X?
That's a huge problem in India there, is that the way that electrification initiatives from the grid are really, there's such a tension between that, because the risk of, as you said, it's one thing for a lantern or maybe even a solar home system, but to invest in a large grid and then suddenly the centralized grid comes down. But we saw that in Darnay exactly, even before the transformer came there was this already an expectation of what they should pay because the neighboring village had some electricity, and that was already way below a market rate. So how you're describing to people, oh no, why that should be higher, and why it's a very difficult thing to actually get across.
So they said, they look at the neighbors and say, we are paying X amount of money, and we are getting, let's say, 8 hours. You're charging us Y, and you're giving us only 4 hours or 5 hours, or you're saying you're giving us 8 hours. You're limiting what we can use, what services we can use, while the other villages don't have that challenge. How do you explain that? How do you explain that commercially that they are different? An end user sees the end use case for him and says, this is what I'm used to, this is what I'm clear with, and this is what I'm willing to pay.
So yeah, to answer that question again, honestly, we also started charging rates like 150 rupees, which would be less than $3 a month, and it's unsustainable. We just cannot even recover. We have written off some of the assets that we built, and often, as we discussed, a lot of those are shaped by political and various other reasons as well as the neighbors. But an area that we see, which is an interesting area, like the project we are talking about here with Mr. Mang, is a community that already has electricity, and meaning they have the grid connection at that lower tariffs, but they don't get it. So they're willing to pay more because the money they are spending on kerosene right now, in spite of having a grid connection. So we told them this is what the cost will be, and if we divide this up, this is how much you'll need to pay, which ends up being maybe $6, $7 a month. And they're willing to pay for that. And the way we are approaching it is, we are not going and telling people that, hey, we'll build it and they will come. It's more about pull, which is that this is possible if you want it, but all of you need to sign up and you're going to pay for it. And this is what it will cost. So now the commercial becomes interesting also. Again, depends on what their alternate sources are. All these are, I must say, are still experiments. I cannot tell you today that we have figured it out and this is the model that we can scale. But we are trying all of these various things out.
Sorry, go ahead. Take another question.
Thank you. It is a very extremely educating session, because everybody has a good intention, but sometimes good intention is not enough to run a project at the reality. So because there are different situations in Bihar and Assam and other, so they now because in the definition also the microgrid, DC, AC, different definition is also there. So reality is also different. So is there any success that we can take it so that it a more experiment and then finally can be matured mini grid or microgrid in a level, some of the experiences from Bihar and other, what are the key elements that from the very beginning an entrepreneur or a small micro energy company can be very sure from the day one in the planning and to implementation stage? What are the key elements that you urging for a new entrepreneur to start a microgrid or a mini grid?
There's this, why don't we do this, like maybe a single most important thing I think that you think might be required in order to develop a sustainable microgrid model
I
from an
think
enterprise?
right at the outset, set expectations on pricing, set expectations of what can be delivered, and set expectations that this is what we can deliver, and this is all we can deliver. Do not set wrong expectations, and communicate that extremely clearly with the community and get the community to accept that before we start.
I would say don't base your business model on selling people energy for more than they're currently spending on other energy-related services. But design your mini-grid so you can scale up if there is a willingness to spend, but don't be dependent on it.
Yeah, I'll add comments to entrepreneurs. I think we heard in the morning session as well, which is about scaling, right? It's great to do 1 or 2 demonstration projects with equity. But to scale, how are you going to finance it? You have to think about that. So partnering is going to be very important. Partners that can bring that scale financially and help you scale in terms of raising the capital. That's going to be a big deal. And then operating and maintaining it is also going to be one of the key issues. And the interesting thing I'll say is that as a large company, we are very clear about our weakness, which is on the ground side, on the social engagement side, while we can bring the other side. So for entrepreneurs, if you recognize that you bring your strength is going to be on the local engagement, on the social side, and you partner with somebody else that bring the other pieces, together you can do a lot more than trying to do it all alone.
Mr. Mang?
I think we are on the same line. The thing is that we are using a different words, but it all comes down to all transparency from the beginning, and be sincere and be true to what you are expressing to the villages in terms of the microgrid. And once you are in sync with the villages, I think it can go, but the expectation is always high from the villages. And it's that you have to rather bring them down. Because the expectation, they'll talk about fruits, TV, what not. But those things we have to be very be conscious and tell them right from the beginning that this thing, if you have that, it'll be like this. So that the transparency and trust is very important.
Right. I think one of the things that was very interesting in the case of WSDS and Manipur as well is that you'll go and talk to community members and they're unwilling to pay the utility. They look at the utility as this large sort of faceless entity that is unaccountable to them. But what you found out, because of the trust and relationships you have with those communities through all of your programs, they will pay you. There is a face there. There is a trust relationship there. So in a way that you become this, again, trust agent that they feel like they have to pay in order to get service, which is interesting. Any other questions? Back here. Right here with glasses.
I've got a question, and I wondered if you've ever seen the direct competition of the two models of solar home systems and the microgrid that tries in the same way to provide energy access to rural households that didn't have it previously, and how in that scenario it shaped out, which one had the upper hand, and if you learned any particular lessons from such an example.
If I were to address that question, the way I see it, just through all the different experiences and talking to people, if you think about the so-called pyramid, there is that segment really at the bottom for whom the only solution that might work for them is a solar lantern. And if you go to the next level, it would be a solar home system. And as you keep going up, the next level is where they want a mini grid. And of course, the one above that are people like us that are tied to the grid. So depending on how you see the segment of the market, so that's one view. Another view I would share is the same group, if you will. After they have experienced something, they move up. For example, I was in Bangladesh, where of course solar home systems are extremely popular. And I was talking to villagers that have had solar home systems for a number of years that were asking for mini grid. And the reason They understand the limitations of the solar home systems. They were watching black and white 12-volt TVs, if you will. Now they want a big color TV. They want to run other things that they cannot run with the solar home system that they have. So if you try to fit the solution in the wrong place, of course, it appears like it can be competitive. But if we identify it clearly, there is a specific niche where each one will fit.
I'd add that one of the differences that may become a driving factor is regulatory. I mean, there's many places where you could sell people an expensive solar home system with less value for the money you're spending, but you're legally not allowed to sell them a mini grid. Because you can't provide energy as a service, you can only provide it as a good. Even if, you're talking about rent-to-own model, which has the same, similar payment, or you're paying more for less service. You can do it legally, but you can't sell a mini grid. I mean, as we all know, governments are the biggest barrier to energy access in many places.
I'll try to twist this question around that you've asked. The first factor is that solar home system is a very individually driven product. And the benefits of a larger grid connectivity, especially when it extends to pumps and other areas of productivity and other consumption areas, actually alter the whole economics. Number two is the maintenance of solar home systems as an individual is always a challenge. Through a grid system, you know that there's somebody else maintaining it for you and taking ownership for you. So I think those are the two key factors why I personally believe that when a grid comes in, the solar home systems start to fade away. Though it may not happen always, but that would typically be the trend.
I mean, right now, Mr. Mang, as part of your business, you have a solar home system business and a growing microgrid one. Where do you see this 5 years from now, maybe, in terms of what will dominate?
See, home lighting system will be there. It will not just go away. As we had discussed, there will be a different segment who will go for home lighting system, and there will be a segment who can only afford lanterns, and there will be a segment again where in a village you can go for microgrids. So every segment has a different, totally a different game, and I see microgrid moving ahead much better in the northeastern part of India because village traditional institution is very strong, and they are still homogeneous, and they are all having one village will have just one tribe or clans or community. So working in microgrid level will be much more beneficial in terms of looking into WSDS perspective.
Yeah, that's one thing that was striking is going to Darnay, and there's all that heterogeneity and competing groups, and in Manipur, socially, it's very different. There's a lot more sort of cohesiveness, I guess you could say, where it's a different problem. But I think isn't there a problem, though, where, the issue of, microgrids don't necessarily provide more power than a solar home system, And the idea of a microgrid that does that tends to be a very expensive microgrid that's also one that really can't be paid for without a significant amount of subsidy.
I don't think we should look at the difference in size as one of the things that distinguishes mini-grids from solar home systems. Right. And we see solar home systems that go up to multiple kilowatts, and we see mini-grids that are as small as 40 watt hours per day, so it's like 10 watts. Right, so that range they cross over very dramatically. In fact, one of the advantages the mini-grid has is you can actually deliver from one service a whole bunch of different ranges of service expectation, right. Which is something that's very hard to do with a solar home system business because there tends to be one size of solar home system available in a market because it's whoever's doing that market.
And just one thing also, like we can use, we can promote home lighting system. Why microgrid? That also can be it can be also a debate. It's like a half cup of water full and half empty. With our perspective, we see a bigger role in terms of microgrid when it comes to. That's why we are saying we are going to go ahead with microgrids. And that's the larger picture of the organization looking in terms of the coming future, the coming years working with the community. So I think it goes both ways, but it is always a debatable question.
Chris, if I may add, one nuance that we should not forget is it's not one size fits all. When we talk about averages, then it sounds like, okay, it's the same thing, but it's not like that. It's like saying, you can have a Model T as long as you want a black, right? That's the only color you'll get. Even in a village, within a village, you will find layers or different capabilities to pay and aspiration and demand. Not everybody wants the same amount of electricity, and not at the same time also. So one thing that the microgrid brings is the pooling that you do together allows you to have a peak load. For example, somebody wants to use a grinder, whether it's a personal home grinder or a community grinder. A microgrid can support that, whereas a solar home system cannot support that. Because different people will use at different times, that pooling effect allows to serve that an independent home system cannot serve.